Dueling banjos.
You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
JT Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Ford,
Corey Doctorow,
Brandon Sanders,
Robin Mott,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
Luke Bauserman.
Find all of the archives of the show at hankgarner.com. If you find some episodes that you like in the archives, would you do me a favor and share those with your friends, family, and loved ones? I would really appreciate that. I hope you enjoy all of the great shows that we bring you, and the reason we're able to bring you such great content is because of our sponsors, and I would like to thank some of those sponsors. If you would like to sponsor the show and highlight your product or service to our audience, go to hankgarner.com, and there's a link in the menu there at the top that says advertise, and you can highlight your product or service to our audience. Nick Breaker's book Essence, Book 1 Septima, one of the best science fiction writers I know. Nick Breaker weaves some of the best science fiction adventure stories you'll ever read. Essence, Book 1 Septima is a must-read. Go pick it up today. There's a link to it in the show notes. Third Scribe is the place for authors and readers to meet. Go to thirdscribe.com. You can set up an account for free, and you can link up with some of your favorite authors and find out what's going on with them. Authors, you need to have a place where you can highlight your books to your audience. Thirdscribe.com is built especially around books, linking people that love books with people that write books. Go visit them today. Thirdscribe.com. Tell Rob and the folks that I sent you. Tales from the Canyons of the Damned. Episode 20 just dropped today. It is amazing, with stories by Jess West, Rhett Bruno, Eamon Ambrose, Bob Williams. Tales is my favorite monthly publication. Go pick it up today and get that old pulp goodness feeling. Tales from the Canyons of the Damned, episode number 20, out right now. Also, don't forget, we're highlighting Tales of Dystopia this week, and we've got a special interview show with some of the authors from it. But Chronicle World's Tales of Dystopia, 13 stories of animals and humans interacting at the end of the world. This project also benefits Pets for Vets, one of the most outstanding charities out there, linking up rescue animals with veterans that need some companionship. So go pick up a copy of Chronicle World's Tales of Dystopia. It's only 99 cents while it launches. At the end of the show, don't forget we have an audiobook clip from Richard Cleaves, the Jason Crane series. Thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the stories and the storytellers. Today I'm really excited to bring you a show with Luke Bauserman. Luke is one of my favorite kinds of people. He tells stories about rural America and all of the weirdness that is kind of behind the stories that you hear, and legends and folklore and all of that kind of stuff. So when Dawn, who does all the scheduling, when she told me that she got Luke and she started showing me some of the stuff, I said, oh man, I cannot wait to talk to Luke and us kind of compare notes, because I write some of those kind of stories as well, and those are things that really intrigue me. So anyway, I'm going to ramble on all night. Thanks for joining me, Luke.
Oh, thank you, Hank. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, Luke, I begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or a storyteller?
You know, I think I'd have to give my mom credit for the writing side of that question.
As most of us do.
As most of us do. When I was really young, I mean, probably starting back even earlier than I can remember, actually, she would staple together a couple pieces of paper and fold them over to make a little blank booklet. And then she would have me draw pictures, illustrations on each of the pages. And then I would tell her the story of what those illustrations were, and she would write that down with the illustrations. And so I kind of grew up always thinking that, eventually I was going to write a real book like the kind I checked out at the library.
That's awesome. Were you a big reader when you were young?
Absolutely, yeah. One of my fondest memories of a birthday was, I believe I was probably 7 or 8 years old, and my parents got me the box set of The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, the Chronicles of Narnia, and my own Bible, all in one birthday. And
Good Lord, did you give them Parent of the Year award?
I tell you what, it was it was a birthday that I still remember very, very well and very fondly. Those were kind of what I cut my teeth on reading, and outside of these books, and I've been reading novels ever since.
Too cool. Tell me where you grew up, Luke.
I grew up in southeastern Ohio. Zanesville is the name of the town. But it's just kind of there on the edge of Appalachia.
Yeah. So tell me what is it about southeastern Ohio and the Appalachian region that makes it really stand apart? And some folks, when you think Ohio, you don't really think Appalachia, but there's the vein that runs right through there and connects a lot of rural America, and it may be north of the Mason-Dixon line, but there's a lot of common threads that run through that area.
Yeah, Appalachia is kind of an interesting region in that it spans, both sides of the Mason-Dixon line. But I'd say that there's definitely a storytelling culture here, and people really care about language. There's a lot of language-based humor that you hear in the expressions and the idioms that people use, as well as a boatload of folklore that has been kept alive for hundreds of years. Some of it, the roots go back to England and over into Europe and was brought over when colonists came over to the United States and settled here, and has been kind of changed and also preserved in a way in Appalachia.
Yeah, and most of our traditional country music and bluegrass for sure, are really Irish and Scottish fiddle tunes, that have been adapted and morphed, a little bit to the local flavor, but there's a lot of those roots there.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really rich culture.
For sure. And there's a big oral storytelling culture, like you said, and most of us down in the South, our people either came from the French up through the Gulf, or our people filtered down from Appalachia after they came over on the boats, and so I think we inherit a lot of that down here as well. And especially when you're dealing with parts of the country that have been, dealt with poverty and things for so long, that the tradition of storytelling is a lot of times the only entertainment. But not only that, but it's a way of survival. It's how you carry on traditions. It's how we pass things down. Yes,
absolutely.
So, one of your pictures I found, and I laughed out loud when I saw it, is you playing a banjo, and there's a possum hanging right next to you. Tell me about that.
So yeah, I enjoy playing banjo, real old time stuff, and I happened to run across a taxidermist that had a stuffed possum that they let me use for that little photo shoot there, and I thought, this is just too good an opportunity to pass up. So,
and what's the possum's name?
Possum's name is George Jones.
Of course it is.
Yes. Only fitting.
Only fitting. And if you either get that joke or you don't, and if you don't, you can go Google it. We won't explain it to you because it loses something when we explain it to you.
Yeah.
So did you grow up in a musical family?
I didn't really grow up in a musical family in terms of playing instruments, but there was always country music playing around the house when I was growing up. And I would say, when you're talking about kind of the culture of storytelling, that's definitely a big part of my family. But my dad told me all kinds of stories growing up. My grandpa did. My great grandma was living for a long part of my childhood, and she did. So that goes way back.
Yeah, I remember as a kid, we would have, we would go to a neighbor's house, and all the men would sit on the porch and play music, and you would pass guitars around and stuff like that, and you would sing and you would pass these songs along, but the stories between the songs were some of the best things ever, and I wish I had sense enough when I was real little to have paid attention the way I would have paid attention now. And that's one of the great tragedies of youth is you don't have the sense enough to pay attention when you should have.
That's so true. Yeah. That's so true. A lot of good stories have been lost that way, I think.
Oh yeah, yeah. I play a little banjo too, but only if it's in the key of G. I can play anything in G, and anything.
No, that's all you need.
That's all you need. Yeah. Yeah, that's another one. You either get it or you don't. So
three chords and the truth, man.
That's it. That's all you need. That's all you need. Oh man. So Luke, at what point? Well, first off, tell me about those fantasy novels that your parents got you. Like, what did that do for you because they bought you all of the classics kind of at once.
Yeah.
So what did that do for you as a young man, and did it light a fire in you, a creative fire?
It really did. I remember reading The Hobbit on my school bus on the way to and from school, and and The Lord of the Rings and all of that, and reading Tolkien's description of the Ents and the forests in Middle Earth, and looking out the bus window at the trees that we were passing, and just kind of projecting what I was reading onto the world outside the school bus window, and it was really, really fuel for my imagination, and I couldn't get enough. I consumed all of that stuff. I was a big Brian Jakes fan, who wrote the Redwall books. As a child, I have copies of those that I read so much as a kid. I literally, read the covers off the books. That really, I would say, sowed the seeds for me to go on and write. And even then, it inspired me to try to write. And I was always, exploring different stories that I dreamed up, whether for a school project or just on my own time.
Right. And I love that your parents packaged a Bible with it as well. If you in rural culture, when you get your own Bible for the first time, that's kind of a rite of passage as well.
Absolutely. It had my name embossed on the front of it, and right. It's like your book, and even reading the Old Testament, a lot of those stories really, there's some pretty riveting stories in there, and those captured my imagination, and just the, kind of the strange old feel of the language in the King James, is something that this near and dear to my heart.
Yeah, for sure. Talking about those fantasy stories you're talking about a minute ago, when you live in a rural place, like I remember as a kid reading Tolkien and then going to play in the woods behind my house, and I could easily imagine that I was in Middle Earth, in one of those scenes. It's we almost live in a fantastical setting, or something that could be pretty easily, if you just kind of looked at what was going on behind there. And I'm a big, kind of proponent of stories that really peel back the layers to see what's behind things. And as a young writer myself, I know that was a big part of my imagination, kind of making me into who I am, kind of taking the stories I read and then going out into the world and kind of imagining how they would play out where I live. I know you talked about being on the school bus and imagining what was out there. Did you ever go out and kind of dream up your own stories?
Oh, absolutely. I think probably compared to a lot of people my age, I had, kind of an old-fashioned childhood. We never really had, video games or anything. Not that my parents were against them. We just didn't, and I spent most of my time outside with my siblings, and we had, forts built, and there were most summers growing up, I can say really with no exaggeration, I spent more time sleeping outside in that than I did in the house, and we would build these rock shelters and sleep in them, and all of that was always accompanied by, this kind of play acting storytelling that kids do. And just kind of projecting your imagination onto the world around you.
Yeah. At what point did you start to become fascinated with the legends and folklore of the area where you live?
Well, when I was there was a period of time when I was growing up that my family moved to Minnesota, and we came back, and I was a teenager, and that kind of did something in terms of my perception of where I was from. I kind of came back and could see it with an outsider's eyes. And I think that was when I first started to realize, like, hey, there's a culture that's unique to this place, and I'm part of it. This isn't just the same as everywhere else, And I think that's kind of where that fascination began. And so then some of the stories that I'd heard growing up, and that I started to wonder, well, where did that come from? Does anybody else know this? And started to dig into the roots of some of the stories I was familiar with, and then expanded into ones that other people told me that they had grown up with.
What were some of those? What were some of the things that kind of surprised you the most, or really captured your imagination? What are some of the prevailing kind of folk tales around where you live?
Oh, I would say, Talipo or Talybone, depending on where you're from. That's a big one that a lot of people are familiar with. Rawhead and Bloody Bones is one that I think is pretty prevalent all throughout Appalachia and the South, as far as I've been able to tell. And then here in Ohio, a lot of kind of historical / tall tale stories about early frontiersmen, like Simon Kenton, kind of these Daniel Boone type characters. Luke Bauserman was a big one. But these, early settlers of Ohio back when it was the frontier, a lot of that.
Gotcha. Why do you think some of those are a lot of those tales are so dark? What do you think it is about the people and kind of the mood of the place that makes a lot of those so dark?
Sure. I think, in part it's affected by the landscape. You have these hills and hollers and these mountains and these coves into the mountains that are so deep, it might only get sunlight a couple hours a day, at least direct sunlight. So, living in these kind of isolated pockets, I could see, people kind of picking the atmosphere of the landscape in the storytelling. I think the other thing that I've learned as I've gotten into the history of Appalachia is, there's a lot of history of poverty and hard living, with the coal mining history and that. And people tend to tell stories that reflect their experience. And I think these scary stories that are targeted at children almost serve as like a vaccine in a way. You are kind of inoculating children against a scary, fictitious thing, and in hopes that that you're sending them out into the world equipped to deal with truly scary things that they'll have to face in in reality. That's kind of one of the things, with my own kids. I find, some of the stuff that they watch on Disney Channel or something like that, I feel like, doesn't have any substance to it or that. And I think it kind of goes back to what I was used to growing up and, compared to some of the fiction that's targeted at children nowadays.
Yeah, I think you're right, Luke. And I think as storytellers, there's an odd thing that happens in the telling of those stories. Like I remember as a little kid, I was scared of everything. I was scared of the dark. And, I was like a nervous little kid. And so I shied away from a lot of like horror and scary things like that. And just, it just never was really my cup of tea. And then I started writing, and I found myself writing like some really dark stuff. And in one book, I wrote Seventh Son of a Seventh Son. There's actually a whole chapter there that revolves around a ritualistic child sacrifice in like 500 BC. And I got finished writing, and I was like, oh my God, I would never watch that or read that. And here I just wrote a whole chapter with gruesome detail and stuff. But there's something that happens to the storyteller in the telling of those stories. It's almost a cathartic thing. It's like it's like you said, it's like inoculating against the evil, that the real evil you come up against. If we can name the thing and we can look it in the eye, and we can walk away from it, then we have conquered the thing. And so would you like to speak to that a little bit about the storyteller's role in kind of facing down the darkness?
Sure. I think that you're really onto something there, and your experience really mirrors my own. I've actually, to this day, I wouldn't call myself a diehard horror fan, at least in the modern sense of the genre. But I do enjoy these older spooky tales that they're very different than horror as we think of it today. And I think that these stories that that storytellers have told and passed down over centuries kind of carry with them this moral weight that I think is part of the storyteller's role in facing down the evil in the world. It's oftentimes these tales are cautionary tales, or they are tales of tales that illustrate maybe something dark or something tragic as a warning to the listener. And I think of even things as simple as some of the people that I've interviewed for my blog when I was delving into the Rawhead and Bloody Bones story. That's a pretty horrific thing. This two-part monster, this skeleton that carries around its own head, that scares children. And I as I heard different versions of the story, I realized that there was this recurring theme of this being a monster that came out of a well. And it became very apparent to me that really, what the storytellers were probably trying to accomplish was to keep the children away from the well, which was a real danger, And then this really kind of entertaining, morbid, dark, folklore emerged out of that. But there was a real practical reason behind it, and in some ways, telling a child a story about a monster that comes out of the well would be easier than telling a child a story about, maybe a child that you knew, maybe a sibling that actually drowned.
Yeah, I can completely see that. And then as the thing grows and grows, because we come from a storytelling culture, we want to add embellishment, and the cautionary tale gets bigger and bigger and more elaborate, and next thing you know, you've got a legend,
Yeah,
that's built around it.
Yeah.
Speaking of that website, you've got this great website, the Weekly Holler, where you almost you act as a reporter. It's got this very kind of journalistic feel where you, Luke, are going out and you're collecting these stories and kind of trying to dissect them and see where they come from and all of that. first off, tell everybody what a holler is.
So a holler is a hollow in I guess actual official English spelling, and it's kind of a depression or I guess you could call it almost a miniature valley that runs between two hills or down the side of a mountain.
Yeah, and if it was any deeper, it'd be a gully. But
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
right. Oh, so the Weekly Holler. Tell me about this and how you came to be kind of the investigative reporter of Appalachia.
Well, it's kind of an interesting journey for me. I had been researching stories for my own fiction for quite some time, and had kept a lot of notes and had amassed a lot of notes and a lot of books on folklore, and had talked to a lot of people that also were familiar with a lot of the traditional folklore of Appalachia, and I got to wondering one day, I thought if I'm interested in this, I wonder how many other people out there are as well. And so I started the blog. It wasn't actually even a blog to begin with. It was just an email newsletter that went out, and I would tell some of these stories, and then also invite people to share theirs, and kind of offered the website as a place for people to preserve stories that they had passed down in their families or that they had heard growing up, and it just kind of took on a life of its own. To tell you the truth, I had a lot of people found it and shared it with family members, and some of the stories that I was covering were would find their way to ancestors or to posterity of the person that I was talking about, and so then they would get all excited and chime in and add to what I had found with stories that had been passed down in their families. And so that's how the Weekly Holler came about, and the name is kind of a play on words with I don't know if you're familiar with over in West Virginia and over in the mountains. Hollering was also a way, kind of a long distance form of communications. People would hoot and holler, as they say, and actually had kind of a code worked out to pass messages from holler to holler there in the mountains.
Yeah, it's like a verbal Morse code.
Yeah,
kind
of like an American version of, I don't know, like yodeling or something. Right. Kind of. If you hear it, it's kind of strange.
Right. You got 3 hoots and 2 hollers means we need a cup of sugar.
Yeah.
Yep. Or there's a mass murder on the loose. It's,
yeah.
You can get them mixed up too easy.
Yep.
Oh man. So Luke, at what point did you start to realize that you had the storytelling gene? Tell this great story about your mom and that she really kind of sparked that in you. But at what point did you realize this is something serious that that I'm going to start working on and work on my craft?
I think for a long time I just kind of had this this vague goal of becoming a writer, and didn't put a lot of thought into it. And in school I won some different contests and stuff growing up with my writing, and always felt like it was something that was a passion that I wanted to pursue. But I'd say the rubber really met the road when I met Holland. He's a fantasy author and a really well-known writing instructor. And in fact, he's taught a lot of really well-known authors, Stephanie Myers, Brandon Sanderson, Ann Wells.
Who was it? You dropped out just a second. Who?
David Farland.
Oh, yeah.
So I met him and kind of decided to get serious about my writing and to really learn the craft, to really start learning the craft. I don't think you can ever say that you've completely learned the craft of writing. It's an ongoing thing. But he really took me under his wing in a course that I took with him, and really helped help me see how I could take the stories that I wanted to tell and craft them into novel length pieces. And so that was kind of the beginning of me actually publishing some stuff.
Nice. Did you always kind of know that you wanted to take some of the legends and folklore of your area and create fiction around that, or was it something you came to later? Like how did that kind of grow organically, or how did you come to that?
Yeah, I think that's always been kind of in percolating in my subconscious. Growing up reading all the classics of fantasy. I read all the classics of fantasy, and it was also mixed with a lot of the Red Fern Grows and Summer of the Monkeys and Gary Paulson, and kind of these writers that had this rural, local flavor to their writing. And I think probably the moment I can point to where I decided that I wanted to pursue this type of writing was I found, oddly enough, it was, you ever been in a library, they're like selling off books that they want to take out of circulation? The big like diggy bin there of books. I was in one in a library, and I was probably 16 or 17 years old, and I picked up a book by an author named Manly Wade Wellman. I don't know if you're familiar with him or not, but he was an author from back in the pulp era, and he wrote a lot of these short stories and novels about this character called Silver John, or John the Balladeer, and he was this character that would roam the Smoky Mountains, and he had this guitar with silver strings and would play, these folk songs, and he was always helping, people in towns, escape from these, supernatural beings from folklore. And it really struck me when I read his stuff, because I thought, man, this is fantasy fiction, and it's written really with this region that I'm from, that I, identify with. It really felt close to home. And I thought, man, I would like to do something like this. And that's where I started thinking about a book called Some Dark Holler.
And so you started thinking about the book. Did you did the story like how did the story evolve to you, and how did you put a kind of an immediate right now spin on these tales?
So I would say that after discovering Manly Wade Wellman's work, I kind of had this idea that I wanted to do something based off the folklore. But as far as the specific story goes, in my undergrad, I studied history, and one of the books that I was reading for a paper that I was writing, I ran across this footnote that kind of led me down this rabbit hole of exploring these firsthand accounts of Appalachia during and right after the Civil War. And one of these accounts from a private in the Union Army that went into this, essentially it was a refugee camp for women and children from the Smoky Mountains. And he just gives this harrowing account of seeing all these, these just destitute women and children, their husbands and fathers had been killed in the war or were, taken as prisoners. And these women, I guess I should back up and say Appalachia was a very divided region in the Civil War. That's why you see a lot of these, Hatfield and McCoy feuds happening in the decades after. There were people fighting on both sides, often from the same town, sometimes from the same family. And, it drove wedges that I think, some remnants of those feuds are still out there to this day. But anyways, these women in these refugee camps were telling their children, I want you to remember this last name because they're the ones that killed your daddy. And when you get big enough, you're going to kill some of them. And the Union officer was just kind of writing with horror, about what are these children going to grow up to be like, with being indoctrinated for revenge, from a young age and having this, kind of the aftermath of this war, casting a shadow over the rest of their lives. And that was when I read that, it really, hit me, got an emotional response out of me. And that's when I knew that I had to dig into that further. And that's where my main character came from, was kind of out of that historical background.
Man, that's some intense stuff. So you started with the character, and how did you start outlining a situation? Did you just kind of start writing and see what story felt right? Kind of how did you get started in that?
Well, as I was starting with this story of a young man, Ephraim Cutler, whose father has been killed in the Civil War, and he's being raised by a mother who is telling him that someday he will take revenge on a Yankee for his father's death. There was instantly some folklore that came to my mind that really fit the tone of the story. In particular, folklore about hellhounds or black dogs, and how they're associated with death and often associated with guilt. And so, as I was kind of outlining the story about this young man that commits a crime and then finds himself looking for redemption, the hellhound really stood out in my mind as a great monster that is kind of an external representation of guilt and being pursued by your own conscience. Somewhere between just the redemption story and this folklore that I felt fit it so well, I found myself with a plot, and then I had that when I started working with David Farland, and he really kind of helped me take the clay that I had on the wheel and learn how to make a pot out of it, to learn the structure of a thriller plot and a fantasy plot, and to kind of see how that applied to the story I wanted to tell.
Love it. How do you describe this book to people when we want to put things into these nice little buckets where this is an urban fantasy. It has the elements of urban fantasy where we've got kind of real world and with fantastical elements bleeding in, but it's not in an urban setting. And it's a mystery and a thriller, and it's kind of all these things kind of rolled up into one, because I have the same problem trying to put genre and category to when you tell things about rural America but fantastical fantasy elements happening. A lot of times people just kind of scratch their head and they're like, well, I don't really know what you call it. So how do you go about trying to tell people what you write?
Well, on Amazon it's a supernatural thriller or dark fantasy, but when I'm describing it to people, I usually tell them that it's a supernatural Southern Gothic novel. That's about the closest thing I could, if I had to put a label on it, that I would go to. And there certainly is that there. I discovered Flannery O'Connor and Cormac McCarthy and William Faulkner and that all as a young adult, and really, really loved that stuff, and felt like that kind of fit the not supernatural part of the story. So it's that with the folklore.
Yeah. And those writers you mentioned are very known for their use of language and phrasing, and Faulkner never met a word he didn't like, and therefore he uses it 100 times.
Yeah.
In a page, and Cormac McCarthy's kind of the opposite of that. Like he never met any punctuation that he did like.
Yeah.
And Flannery O'Connor, she just weaves these awesome stories so full of, you just feel like you're right there. But when we first started talking, you mentioned that the region of Appalachia is very, it almost has a feel to the language. Language is very important. The way you phrase things, the way you weave in a turn of phrase. There, almost a lot of little cultural puns that are thrown in here and there. And if you are from there, you get it. And if you're not, you just scratch your head and you think these people are idiots. And there's really a lot going on under there that, you just kind of have to be hip to it to understand. Does your writing in this book, do you notice a very specific style that you are representing in the writing?
I'd say I aspire to write, like those big Southern Gothic authors. They're my heroes on a prose level and on a dialogue level. And in some ways, some of the characters that I wrote in this book were, it felt so good to write them because they're people that I, composites of people that I know, and these characters that I don't feel like I've gotten to read about very often. I don't feel like they're very represented in fiction. I have an old granny woman in the book that is kind of my outlet for all of these wonderful Appalachian sayings that slicker than a peeled onion, and crooked as a dog's hind leg, and meaner than a rooster with teeth. All of these all of these metaphors and really colorful ways of saying things.
Oh, that's awesome. You talked a little bit earlier, Luke, about the coal mining culture and how that kind of the region and the land and the resources really kind of shape what life is like there. As Appalachia is changing and the coal industry is changing and a lot of places leaving, and what do you see as the investigative reporter of Appalachia that you are? What do you see about the way the culture's changing, and what do you think that's going to do to the next generation of people that are growing up? And also an extension of that question would be, how do you feel like the internet and things like that where the world is really shrinking, do you think that we're threatened to lose the things about the regional culture that makes it so special?
That's a good question.
It's like a good 18 questions.
Yeah, good 18. Yeah, that's some heavy stuff there. I think. I guess let me break down what you were asking there. You were asking about kind of the future of Appalachia, economically,
right? And what that does to our storytelling culture.
Yeah, I think everything is, in terms of innovation and technology, is a double-edged sword, and it brings new opportunities, but it also brings with it some dangers. I think the internet has definitely given Appalachia, along with everywhere else, the opportunity to share the culture that you find there on a level that has never been possible before. And I see some people that are really doing a good job of that. That it just makes me so happy to see what they're doing. There's a blogger named Tipper Presley that runs a blog called The Blind Pig and the Acorn, and every day she's posting and preserving Appalachian culture and lore, and it's wonderful to see what the internet has allowed her to do. I think in general, maybe I'm biased being from here, but I feel like part of the culture is this kind of resourcefulness that has always been there. People, as coal mining, as the coal mining industry kind of faces an uncertain future, it will, things are bound to change, and they're always changing. But I like to think that it's not the first hard time that Appalachia has faced. There have been other, there was, the timber industry and other, industries that have come and gone kind of in Appalachia. And the people here are, I think, resilient and resourceful people. And, I think Appalachia will find ways to get along just fine. And it'll be kind of part of the continuing story of the region.
Yeah. And, what you don't want to do is hold nostalgia. You don't want to be so nostalgic that you overlook all of the bad stuff of the past, and because you're trying to hold on to the good thing that you see. What you have to do is remember the story for what it was, and hopefully. To have people like you that are carrying forth the traditions and the folklore, while allowing the region to move forward economically and socially and all of that good stuff. But what we don't want to do is lose those things that make us uniquely who we are. And so that, that's one of the important things about writing books like you do is, to remember those things and to those stories going forward, while we move forward as a people. So, I love what you're doing. Some of the blurbs, that you got for the book, some of the reviews are phenomenal. J.D. Wilkes from the legendary Shack Shakers. How did you get that?
JD and I are kind of social media friends.
Nice.
And he had a book come out.
The Vine That Ate the South.
The Vine That Ate the South. And I was lucky enough to review that for him on my blog. And so we were talking about that, and he plays banjo. So we got that common interest. And he was kind enough to be one of my advanced readers for Some Dark Holler.
Awesome. And also one of my favorite writers of all time, Richard Gleaves, blurbed it as well. How did you connect with Richard?
Richard had come on to the Weekly Holler for an interview in its early days to talk about the legend of Sleepy Hollow and the folklore there in New England. And we just had a great time talking. And I sent him a book of Appalachian folklore after our interview because I think we're really into the same type of things. So that's how we met each other.
And there's a lot of connection between those stories that Richard's writing about and that particular folklore. And when you start looking into the folklore of the area that you're writing about, there really are a lot of similarities.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
It's so cool. So you start realizing that the more, you peel back the layers, we all, there's this common storytelling thread through us and us as a nation, and it really links us together. It's crazy.
It really does.
Start seeing how the pieces fit together.
Yeah.
So the book that you have out is Some Dark Holler, but you also have a companion to that you can get for free at your website, can't you?
Yeah, it's called Six Tales from 6 Mile Creek. And in that, I kind of present 6 of the stories from history and folklore that really inspired the story, that account from the Union officer in the refugee camp is in there. And you can read it in his own words, along with some hellhound folklore and some bear folklore that is common around Appalachia, and some other stories that are some of my favorites.
Nice. Are there any spoilers in there? If we read that before Some Dark Holler, is it going to mess it up for us?
No, I don't think so at all. You could start with that one and then read Some Dark Holler.
Excellent. And tell everybody where they can go pick up that free book.
Just head on over to lukebauserman.com and you will see it right there on my homepage.
Excellent. And where can I guess that's the best place to connect with you online? Is at your website?
Yeah, I'm on my website, and then I'm also on Facebook. I have an author page, and also there's a page for the Weekly Holler. I'm pretty active there, and you can find me on some of the other social media channels as well.
Awesome. Luke, I love what you're doing, and I hope you keep it up, brother. Do you have something else you're working on now that Some Dark Holler's out?
Yeah, so it is the first in a series, and the book 2 is well underway and is looking like it'll be out and published sometime here in spring of 2018. And there will be more further adventures of Ephraim Cutler beyond that.
Awesome. Luke, thank you so much for taking time to come on the show, man. We need to get together and pick banjos sometime.
Absolutely. Dueling banjos.
That's right. Just stay away from rivers. Yeah. Luke, thank you so much for taking time to come on the show.
Thank you, Hank. My pleasure.
Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. For more great author interviews like this one, go to hankgarner.com and dig through the archives. There's something there I know you'll love. Now stay tuned for a special audio clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
Jason ate Thanksgiving dinner alone at the Horseman restaurant. He had the place to himself. Everyone else had somewhere to be. He picked at his burger and fries, thinking of meals past. Thanksgiving had always been Eliza's favorite holiday, as Halloween had always been his. Jason glanced at the menu propped at his elbow. The horseman with his hand held high, carrying a tray with burgers and a shake. The horseman he'd seen on Halloween was no cartoon. That horseman was a thing of crematorium ash, of grave clothes and withered grass, riding a horse of autumn leaves and snail shells and pieces of skull. Jason's hand rose to the tender stripe of skin on his neck. The hatchet cut. "You okay, honey?" Jennifer, the waitress, appeared at his elbow. She had dyed her hair since he'd first met her. A pink stripe ran through the gray now, as if she had stuck her head in a cotton candy machine. "Yeah, I'm full." She raised an eyebrow. "That bad, huh?" Jason glanced at his plate, still piled with food. "Just not hungry." "You know, I saw the Headless Horseman once," said Jennifer, refreshing Jason's cup. She glanced about, deciding something. She set the pot down on a nearby table and slid into Jason's booth with some difficulty, sucking her belly in. "I've seen him," she whispered. "Just like you." "When?" "Oh, 10 years ago." Jason glanced around to see if the cooks or busboys were watching, to see if she was playing a prank. "Where?" he asked, trying to sound casual. "East of here. Sam and I used to live out on Sawmill River Road. I worked at my daddy's Applebee's franchise, you know. It's still there. Daddy sold it, though. It was around Halloween time and I was coming off shift. It had been a night, believe me. Parties of like 20. We sang to the little brats, 'Happy, happy birthday' from all of us at Applebee's." "The Horseman?" "Right." She produced cigarettes. "Do you mind?" Jason shook his head. "Thanks. Don't tell the smoke police." Jason slid the saucer from beneath his coffee mug to serve as an ashtray. It was about midnight, probably. I counted my tips. And those little bastards stiff you, by the by. So I wasn't in a good mood. I was waiting for Sam to pick me up. I was smoking in the parking lot, trying not to catch my hair on fire, and I heard this thunder, coming down the Picantico Hills from the direction of the hollow. Rumble, 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 but it was clear out, and the sound got closer and closer. We had a full moon that night, hanging over the top of the ridge, and I saw him come up the other side. This black shape on a horse, fast as the devil late for church. He was down the hill before I knew it, coming right at me, and he jumped Sawmill River. Kaboom! And when he reached the parking lot, I saw. She drew one finger across her neck. Nothing. No head. And it wasn't any real horse, either. Too damn fast. He was in a hurry. Didn't even see me. Whoosh! My apron blew up. The dumpster started rolling. Car alarms. Blew out my damn cigarette. He shot across the field. Beeline due east. Never saw anything like it. So... She patted Jason's hand. I know you're getting laughed at. But not by me. She stubbed her cigarette in the saucer. Some of us believe you.